Hello, and welcome to the No Bad Questions podcast, where I try to learn in a conversational manner, to break down jargon, and to present the least amount of filtering as possible on a wide array of topics. I hope that you learn something too. If you do and want to support the podcast, you probably already know all the ways that you can do so. You can like, share, subscribe, hit the notifications, but ultimately, and what I hope you choose to do, is watch to the very end. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's No Bad Questions podcast. I am joined today by Don Frericks. Don works with high-performing executives to become outstanding leaders so that they can lead their organizations to solve problems more rapidly, accelerate growth, and change more quickly. Don's clients are organizations who value leadership effectiveness and desire to develop their leaders. Don's gifted at noticing developmental opportunities and creating ways to enable clients to transform their behavior and experience a powerful long-term impact on their performance. Don's executive experience and dedication to personal development has given him tremendous insights and skills when working with clients. He's pursued his own leadership development for 2 decades and experienced the challenge and joy of being able to transform himself in many different facets of his life. Don, thank you for joining me today.
That's great to be here, David. Thank you.
So I know because I've read it that it's a book, but I believe it's more than a book. What is Best Boss Ever?
Thanks for asking. You know, it's a book that I published at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was really meant to be a resource for people. You know, people will sometimes say, how many have you sold? And I thought, well, that's not really the right question for this book because this was meant to be a giveaway. I intended to try to come up with a very short approach towards leadership development that people could understand, wrap their hands around, and learn to use themselves. Because I thought what was happening during the pandemic is a lot of leadership development programs were being cut. There was an expense concern in many organizations as they were losing revenues rapidly. Right. And so people were kind of left to their own device to try to figure out, you know, what can I do to develop myself as a leader? And that's really why the book was written, to help people learn to be the best boss ever through their own personal leadership development.
Well, thank you for that. And I mean, I think you've got a newsletter, a whole sort of, I'll call it a network of support tools to further this goal of helping people. And one of the things that I wanted to dig into a little bit on the helping people side is, to your point about organizations maybe have cut some of these programs. I think there's a whole lot of content there that we could get into. But the first is, I know that as I've gone through my career as a leader, developing leader, whatever you want to call it, one of the things that's been a challenge for me is dedicating time. You know, I read stuff that says, oh, you should be working to develop your team 10% of your time, stuff like this, ballpark numbers. But I don't know that that's carved out in most organizations to say, oh, you're a director, spend 10% of your time with your team. You have to find that time. And so I wondered, A, is my experience something that you've seen in your experience more broadly? And B, if I'm an employee and my organization is not carving out that time, how can I, for lack of a better phrase, force the issue?
You know, interesting that you bring up time, because that probably is the number one objection that everyone has towards doing anything new. And obviously, if you're starting a leadership development program for yourself, or the company starting it for the company, it's new. There has to be a place for it to show up in your calendar. And if you're going to a workshop, you can go to the workshop, you can leave your office and you can do that. And you say, okay, I went. But, you know, what we find in terms of development, that development today has less to do about experiences and has more to do about the reflection and behavior change that one creates in their own pathway to development. So I'm a big believer, and I think maybe you were kind of alluding to this, David, that, you know, maybe the most important thing for us all to learn as leaders is that great leaders are great learners. Great leaders are great learners. So the question I often ask of leaders, like, how much time do you spend formally learning? And the answer is really poor. so many people can hardly answer that question. Like, what do you mean learn? Like, you mean workshop? You mean read a book?
Right.
You mean listen to a podcast? Like, yeah, I mean, kind of that stuff. But really, that is surface level learning, if you ask me. The deeper level learning is like if you spent time this week thinking about what you did as a leader, the impact of those behaviors on other people, and you really spent some time reflecting on what worked, what didn't work, and what you could do better. To me, that's in-depth learning, where you can really assess yourself through deep reflection and then come up with a plan for next week to do something different as a leader. To me, that's where leadership improvement shows up, when we actually get into the analysis, reflection, and then correction moving forward. It's kind of like PDCA. You probably have studied different forms of continuous improvement, right?
Yeah.
And so that's exactly what it is, but it's applied to your own leadership development.
It's interesting in many ways that you're focused on the reflection element of learning, because I think that's an element that, broadly speaking, we try to shortcut, we shortchange, whatever you want to call it, societally, not just leaders. And I go back to an anecdote I heard. I have no idea if it's true, but that Mr. Warren Buffett, very famous, very wealthy, very successful investor, has very few meetings because he has huge amounts of his time socked away for reflection. And I don't know if that's true, but if it is, and I've seen that about other leaders, successful entrepreneurs, et cetera, that they chunk out meaningful amounts of time for self-reflection or reflection on strategy, or they read a book and then they block time to reflect on the book. Do you think that, so obviously you're advocating for that reflection, which is great, but is there any more to it than that? Or is it simply make time to reflect, do you think?
The question makes me think about the best answer for everyone. And I don't know if there really is a best answer for everyone.
Fair enough.
It does need to be customized to each situation. One of the things that I've noticed about myself is I'm a perfectionist. And maybe many of your listeners can relate to that. And I've been a recovering perfectionist, is what I like to say. But if you ask me at the end of any week, David, what I did this week that was successful, I would probably try to blow you off. I'd say, well, I don't know. I mean, I had a good week. I'm happy about it. I wouldn't be able to give you specifics. Why? Because I really don't know the answer to the question. I haven't reflected on it. And that's kind of a problem, because in all of our occupations and professions, we're all trying to create success. We're all trying to create positive results. And so if we can't answer the basic question of what did I do this week that worked, think about how much drudgery and how much work there's landing on us that we just have to carry along, never feeling successful. So it's a big deal not to know the answer to that question. So I'd have to journal on a Sunday morning to think about and answer that specific question. It ends up in my journal and it says, what were my successes this week? And I'm like, I hate this question. But it's a beautiful question because it makes me actually go back to my calendar, think about the great appointments that I had, which ones were outstanding, which ones were not so good, and write those down and say, what can I learn from those? And that's the second question, not only what were my successes, but what can I learn from there? And just those two questions in a 30-minute period allow me to see things that I wouldn't normally see. We capture things that life is giving us, these wonderful learnings, when we journal in that manner. And when we capture those things, then we can productively utilize them the next week or following weeks after that. But if we just live life and we just kind of go through it and we just stay busy, we don't really slow down to reflect, to capture the learnings, how can we say that we're great learners? I just don't understand how we can do that. Learning cannot be reading books, listening to podcasts, and reading articles on the web. It has to be a deeper experience if we're significantly going to try to change our behavior. And that's why I think the reflection is so important and powerful.
So I don't journal. I'm a big to-do lister. And so what I do is I'm, if it got crossed off the list that week, that day, whatever, that's on the list of successes, right? Because you knock something out. If I'm carrying that, and I deliberately I don't use a digital list because I want to force myself to read, you run out of paper, so you got to go to it next week. And if you're carrying it forward from one week to the next, maybe you need to reprioritize. Maybe you need to say, hey, do I even need to do this thing? Yeah. Et cetera. So that's another technique. And to your point of not every solution fits everybody. I think if you said, David, you have to journal, I would probably just pitch a fit. I mean, it's just not something that, I don't say that I could do, but it's just not, right. It's not in my headspace. So we're talking time, we're talking reflection. And I think if I'm a listener, maybe I'm hearing this and go, well, okay, but I'm so busy. We start out talking about, I don't have time to develop my leadership. I don't have time to develop my team if I am a leader, but you want me to take time to journal, to do to-do lists. How am I supposed to make time for that? So, or what I'm then wondering is, or do you feel like there's a compounding effect over time that if you allocate to this, if you spend the mental energy and effort on this reflection over the long haul, you start to improve in a way that makes it so it's not a time sacrifice? Where do you fall on that? Do you think it's got that compounding, or do you feel like it is, hey, yes, it's a sacrifice of time, but it's worth it? Which side of that would you fall on?
It's an interesting conundrum, and I'm sure many of your listeners will think like, how do you answer a question like that? So I'll try to, I'll give you my best shot at it. I think you're asking the question of the value of everything that's on your calendar. You're not just asking about reflection. So, right. So often I know people that are very busy in back-to-back meetings. It seems like so many of us do virtual meetings now, back-to-back all day long, and we call that our work week. And we say we can't get much done because we're doing all these meetings. To which what I like to do is do an analysis of the meetings that we're actually attending, A, B, C, A quality, B quality, C quality. And it's amazing to me how many meetings people are still attending that are C quality or maybe B minus or B. So there is a lot of fluff on our calendar, but we're busy. So we don't challenge it because we're busy. I think we're attached to busyness. We're not attached to actually output. And so if we really would evaluate all of our meetings and all of the things that we do on our to-do list and really took the A priorities of the A priorities and really narrowed it down to those few things that make the biggest difference, I think we'd find all kinds of time to do learning, to do reflection, to help our team develop their skills. But because we don't do that assessment, we're not really prepared to actually add something else to our calendar or to-do list. I get that. You're right. So the assessment's got to come first, and it has to come from somebody that's hungry to create the space to allow things like reflection and learning and training their people to show up, because it won't happen on its own. You just can't add it to what you're currently doing. And I think that might be what you're alluding to.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And then I wonder, as you mentioned that, some folks are trapped in roles where perhaps they don't have a lot of control over their own calendar, right? They got to be responsive to the boss or to the boss's boss or to the client. Any advice for somebody like that, where I think your advice of using an academic grading scale, I love it. I've used that in the past for honestly managing up and saying to my boss, well, what do you need, an A plus or is a B plus okay on this project? So looking at your meetings in that way really resonates with me, but maybe somebody doesn't have the ability to say no, or doesn't feel, maybe they've got the ability to don't feel confident saying no to a C meeting. What's your advice for that type of individual in that type of role?
Recent experience working with a large hospital, one of their director levels, I guess she was an AVP, was overwhelmed and way too many meetings, couldn't find space to get work done, just back to back, really in the state of kind of starting to lose her mind because she was so out of balance, and it was affecting her personal life, and it just was so daunting for her. And so we talked about meetings, and I said, quite honestly, hey, do you think there are any meetings that you could stop going to? She said, gosh, I'd love to, but I don't think I can. I said, well, why not? And this might get to the crux of your question. Why not? She said, I think I have to be there. I said, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. And as we kind of unpack that, I think it gets to the really the crux of your question, which is we believe that we need to be there because we don't want to miss something.
Right.
And she couldn't even conceive of not going and maybe getting the notes or following up with somebody that had been there or sending someone. And by the way, all three are good options. But because
Right.
she was so consumed with needing to get the information herself, she wouldn't let go until we really started to understand what is that about. That's more about control than it is about, meeting participation. So I think that the challenge for all of us, it's not really our boss that is controlling our calendar as much as we are controlling our calendar. And what we have to think about is how would we prioritize each and every one of those meetings if we were to start over? Are they really adding value to your work week or not? And I think you can find a way to, if you only found one meeting a week that you could peel off, if you just picked up an hour a week, that's fantastic, isn't it? You don't have to take, 10 meetings off your schedule, but I would suggest that everyone has at least one, if not five, that they could probably go to less frequently or go to the start and leave or have someone go for them or get the notes. It's not that difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. One 1 hour meeting a week. I think a lot of people don't do the compounding math. That's 52 hours a year, right? What else could you do with 52 hours in your year than go to a meeting where maybe you're never called upon and never asked to contribute? You're just listening, right? So I think that's very good advice and a very good highlight is to look at the compounding effect of I don't want to say skipping, but opting out of perhaps unnecessary or a C grade meeting. But speaking of compounding effect, and we've talked about investment in your skills over time, one of the things that Best Boss Ever talks about is just how long it takes to really develop leaders. So do you feel like that's part of why companies have withdrawn from leadership development? Because with higher turnover rates and shorter tenure in the modern work environment, maybe they're not going to see that ROI. What are your thoughts on that?
Return on investment when it comes to leadership development is an especially difficult thing to measure precisely. And I think the real reason that companies cut their investment in leadership development is that when there are times where revenues are falling short and we need to have less expenses, you go to the things that are the easiest to identify that could cut without cutting into people's pay or their benefits or the things that generate revenues. So those things are often, maybe marketing, but certainly behind that, an easier one to cut is training and development. So it always seems to be the first thing to go. I'm not suggesting it shouldn't be, but the reason the investment doesn't seem to be coming back, though, is that for a long time, the metrics of return on investment for leadership development hasn't been done. So if you're an executive and you're looking at why should I invest in leadership development, you really are hard-pressed to find any research that suggests that there is a return, a tangible return on that investment. So you might do it because you know it's the right thing to do. You might do it because you want to do it for your people. But from a pure business standpoint, David, it is really hard to ascertain what is the return, the specific metric that I'm going to get. I'm going to, let's say, invest $50,000 into a plan or program. What will I get out of that? Well, there will certainly be some change behaviors. Well, okay, what will those change behaviors yield for the company? It starts to break down after that because people are like, I don't know. I mean, better leadership, is better leadership a bad thing? No, it's not. But will it create business results that we can say tangibly added to the bottom line? Well, that takes a lot more work. It is possible to do, but very, very few companies are willing to do that because that also requires an investment.
Well, and that makes sense. And so knowing that there may not be a lot of hard data, what do you feel like is the number one benefit that companies A, should get, assuming it's successful, and B, and maybe it's a different benefit, maybe it's the same one, that they could measure?
I think it's very easy to look at turnover and engagement, and turnover for sure. And you and I have a shared experience where the company that we both are thinking of had a 26% turnover rate. 26% on a 1,000-person employee company. That's 260 people. every year walking in, walking
Right.
out, walking in. In 5 years, you've replaced basically everyone. So it's amazing to me in organizations that have high turnover that they wouldn't take a look at what they're doing with leadership development. You've heard it said many times, people don't leave a company, they leave a boss. They leave a bad
Right.
boss. They leave a bad leader. And that's very, very true. I don't know if you've experienced it. I think you have, and I certainly have many times.
Sure. Do you the retention and turnover brings up an interesting question that's I think perhaps less about leadership and more about business in general, but do you feel like organizations properly account for the knowledge penalty that comes with turnover? I think that there's all sorts of data. So what I mean is, I think there's all sorts of data out there that says, oh, turnover costs this much per FTE, and you got the hiring costs, and you got the this, and you got the that. But what I don't feel like is well quantified is knowledge turnover. You know, somebody who's been in a business for 10 years, probably for good or for ill, knows where all the skeletons are buried, knows where to go to get things done, knows why a decision was made 7 years ago that somebody who's been there for 2 years doesn't know. And they might be able to find it, but they might not, because who's got the emails from the notes from that long ago? So do you feel like organizations are adequately accounting for that knowledge turnover? And then do you think that the leadership training, if it reduces turnover, obviously you would feel that would improve that as well, right?
Yeah, no doubt. I don't think organizations do account for that knowledge loss. There's no doubt. I was just doing a consulting project for an organization and their human resources department. They have about, let's say, 16, 17 people, so a smaller department. But they had 100% turnover, and everyone in the department is 2 years or less in tenure.
Jeez.
And they were basically saying that the new people were training the new people, but the new people that were training the new people didn't know what the old people knew about how to do work processes and how their systems work. And because they had legacy systems and their workflow wasn't documented, they were at a loss just to be able to get the basic level of work done. So a tremendous outpouring of people and experience had left the organization. And the new people were doing the best they could to try to figure out how to do processes. But without the documentation and without having that expert knowledge, as you're referring to, it's almost impossible to run a department. Mm-hmm. This department is basically falling apart as we speak.
Well, I hope they get that together, first of all. But 100% turnover. So when you say that, I think of, I don't know if you've done much study in your career of military leadership development and military career pathways, but the military strikes me, because of its up or out model, as a version of 100% turnover. You know, somebody is in a job as a private for a certain amount of time, and they're going to move up, right? Or they're going to move out. They're a lieutenant for a while, and then they become a captain, and often that's going to be a transfer. So have you looked at military models of leadership development, and do you incorporate that at all into what you coach? And are there lessons that us civilians could incorporate that you're aware of?
I really haven't, David. I'd like to rely on you. Maybe you can tell the listeners more about what you've discovered, because I think you're onto something. It sounds like there's some good things that we could learn from the military.
I am not ex-military, so I wish I could weigh in more about that. I've got a lot of military colleagues, and I think and just do some of my learning by listening to a lot of military leadership podcast videos, books, etc. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that strikes me, I hope it's true, is they do a lot of recording the policies and procedures. And you mentioned that earlier in that HR department that you're trying to help, is if it's written down, at least it's there on the shelf. I can go get it. If somebody transferred, if they got promoted, if they got fired, if they got whatever, at least it's there on the shelf. And that's something that in when I've done some consulting, it's often working on catching up, polishing up policies and procedures. And so let's bring it back full circle to spending time. Mm-hmm. It sounds like you've seen this as well, but do you do you see that organizations are adequately attending to that, which is, again, maybe more administrative than leadership per se, or do you feel that those really, again, go together?
I think it's hard to say. I don't have an accurate view of whether or not organizations. It probably depends on their cycle of where they're at. A startup certainly isn't going to have great
Right.
documentation, so their policies and procedures could potentially be weak. But you would hope that an organization that had some tenure and had grown up through at least the second stage of success would have their policies documented. I think in today's age that is more normal that would happen, but I don't know how to judge it. I've never seen any research on it, and I don't have any data, so I'm sorry.
No, that's fair enough. So one of the things then that I'm curious your thoughts about is leadership development on the company or is it on the individual? Whose responsibility?
I think the answer is yes. Sorry. I think you're onto something, and this is what I'd love to say to the listeners, is that a lot of us work in companies where there isn't a formal leadership development plan that you qualify to participate in. Maybe there's, other groups of people that actually do and you don't, or maybe they don't have any program at all. That's
Right.
more normal than organizations that do have really robust and well-developed leadership development plans. And because of that, I think most people, David, don't participate formally in leadership development. They are casual about it. They do the books and podcasts and things like that. But there isn't a formalness and there isn't a strong pathway to improving themselves. So what I would say to listeners, and that's the reason why I wrote the book, is use Best Boss Ever or whatever else you can find out there to come up with a formal plan for yourself to get better at leadership. Because there's one skill set that transcends all disciplines within business. It's leadership, right? Mm-hmm. If you want to grow your career, you've got to be a better leader. And wherever you go, whatever company, whatever discipline you're in, if you can demonstrate your leadership effectiveness and your technical functional ability, you'll be amazing. You will always have great jobs, great companies to work at, but you've got to work at it because leadership is part art, part science. It's complicated. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to learn about leadership. We all have our own styles, and our styles often get in our way of being effective with other styles. So to be a great leader, we have to use style modification. We have to understand how to use the strengths of our own style. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of self-mastery. And that just doesn't happen because you've been in a leadership role for 5 or 10 years. There's a lot more to it than that. Have you personally had leadership development experience, or have you always been in companies that didn't offer anything?
So what I would say is that the companies, to your point about some companies offer it for, we'll say, different tiers of the organization. Most of the companies where I've worked have offered it for a tier that I've not reached yet in my career. The exception probably was when I was with Deloitte. They are a major consulting firm. The product they are selling, for the most part, is their people. So they work heavily to develop their people, and I was a beneficiary of that. Some mild leadership development, but more, I would just say, organizational development, team member investment, communication, seminars on better communicating and things like that at some other organizations. So I would say that any organization of moderate size or above, so $100 million or above in revenue that I've worked at, has had at least something, but no succession plans, no formal growth plans. It's been courses, it's been things like that.
Right. I think that's the norm.
Yeah, and I think I agree. I was just thinking, I think that's pretty normal. And to your point about startups probably are not. That's not where they're going to spend their money. For good or bad, that's not where they're going to spend their money. If they're a $5 million organization trying to grow to 10 to 20 to 50, I doubt that's where they're investing their money. They're expecting you to come to the table probably with some good leadership skills if they're hiring you to be at that company. Don, you mentioned about, everybody's got their own style, but we have to adapt. Do you feel that, let me rephrase it. Have you ever seen where culture trumps somebody's leadership, or do you feel like leadership can overcome culture?
Could you say more about that, David? I'd like to give you a more precise answer than what I'm thinking, but
culture is embedded at an organization. It is the unspoken policies. It is the dynamics between individuals. It is not often top down, though I think that the direction a culture is headed is top down. So what I mean is the CEO and the executive suite can model behaviors that people over time will adapt to. And so the culture can be steered by the leadership. But that's not what the culture is. The culture is where it is today. And so if you're a director, an AVP, a manager, a line supervisor, whatever, somebody in the middle, maybe you're the best leader in the world, but your culture is negative, is toxic. Can you overcome that and inspire your team and do great things? Or do you need to assess a potential change in companies?
Well, the old saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast,
right,
is something I've said to many people, and I do believe that to be true. You're asking, does culture eat leadership for dinner, I guess?
Yeah.
I think it does. I think it actually does. Culture is so powerful that when it's not right for you, and let's not just suggest that maybe there's a feeling that maybe it's not right for the organization, but when it's not working for you, can you change the subculture that you're responsible for? Yes. But can you change the larger corporate culture? Probably not. And so if your question is, should a good leader in a bad culture who's attempted to change the culture consider leaving? I would say absolutely. Yeah. Life is too short. Better to find a good culture with other good leaders that you can make a difference at.
I think that's very fair. And particularly what's fair is your point that cultures are not one size fits all. Individual cultural fit is just that. It's individual. And so somebody might thrive in a fast-paced startup, and somebody else might be like, not for me. And that's me. I like a mid-size or larger business. I think a small business would be tougher for me. I don't know that I couldn't adapt to that, but it's going to be very different. And everybody's got their own cultural preferences and cultural fit they're going to bring to the table. One of the other things you mentioned a moment ago, or a couple minutes ago, was, that leadership is across industries. But is leadership portable? So if I'm in healthcare, if I learn how to be a good healthcare leader, and I go, hey, I'm tired of healthcare, I want to go do manufacturing, I want to build stuff, am I going to one-to-one take my leadership skills across to that industry? Because you've worked across several industries in your career. What have you seen there in terms of the portability of leadership?
Yeah, I like the term portability. I've not used that with leadership before, so I appreciate you coining it that way. I absolutely
feel free to steal it. I think I got it from somewhere else, so I'm not going to try to claim it as mine.
I think it's very portable. I really do. Now, here's the challenge. I think your question also makes us think about, can you move from industry to industry with just leadership skills? And I would say probably not. So can I go from healthcare to manufacturing without knowing anything about manufacturing? That's a difficult change. Does my leadership become portable because I'm going to the next industry? Oh, yeah, absolutely. The leadership will be there, but there still has to be some technical, functional expertise that one brings along with them when they switch industries, unless you're willing to start over and kind of learn the whole industry all over again. So, yes, it's portable, and yes, you need technical, functional knowledge about that particular industry, I believe.
That makes a lot of sense. And I part of why I asked that is I do know I've read several papers and articles on people leaving healthcare. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a tough industry right now. I don't know other industries as well. Obviously, I've not come up professionally in those industries. I'm sure there are some of those where people are leaving disproportionately also. But these individuals have to be going somewhere. So whether that's to retirement or to other industries, I think it's very relevant as a topic. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I know we've got a little bit of time left, so I'm going to go into two sides of the coin on a question. If there was an established senior leader out there, VP, senior VP, CEO, I'm blessed to be networked with some of those types of people. Maybe they'll listen. And maybe they're struggling because COVID's creating burnout for them. They're upset because the younger generation doesn't want to work. Whatever. What's a piece of advice, a tactical piece of advice you'd give to a leader at that stage in their life who's out there listening right now, like a nugget of, hey, keep this in mind, be inspired, whatever about what's going on in the leadership landscape today for somebody in that more senior position?
Is there a reason why you suggest the senior position would be more open, or you're just saying that's a good example?
No, I'm just starting there, and then I'm going to ask you an early career, the flip side of the coin next.
Okay, I thought you might be. So yes, I think the key thing is if you've been in the game for a while and you feel really comfortable in what you're doing and you're perhaps effective or feeling like you're effective, the challenge is getting complacent and not pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. And that happens a lot. I see a lot of 50-year-old executives who've been doing the same thing and are really comfortable with the role that they have. They've maybe got the executive suite and they've got the title and the compensation that goes with it. What's interesting about a lot of those people is they've arrived. And they've arrived because they're at the top of the organization. And unfortunately, when you've arrived, there's a lot more to lose than there is to gain. And what I've seen with most of those leaders is that they do more to self-protect than they do to grow. And it's easy to be complacent and to not push yourself out of your comfort zone, to learn new things about yourself and to learn new ways to lead other people in the organization. So many don't. That's why we don't have leadership development at the top levels of most organizations. Oftentimes they'll have a coach like myself if they have anything, but there isn't really a formal leadership development program because those people won't come to a leadership development program because they're too busy, or I would say too important, or really not interested in learning. And so I think all of us need to continually push ourselves out of our comfort zone to learn something new, to become something that we weren't yesterday. There's always a way to get better, at least 1%. And I think that's the challenge for a big senior level executive who's been around the block for a while.
I appreciate that. And some folks may not enjoy hearing that, but they may secretly feel like it does fit them. And I love the challenge yourself to get out of your comfort zone, in part because that's what my first guest talked about when it came to physical challenges. He's talking about doing the Ironman. So getting out of your comfort zone is a resounding or a recurring theme amongst my guests here on No Bad Questions. And so the flip side, an aspiring leader, maybe somebody who doesn't even have any direct reports yet. What advice, strategy, tactic, something would you give to them to listen to, hear, and take away?
I really think the most important thing early on is to be observant. I did a small qualitative research study. I asked 21 extraordinary leaders or people that had been referred to me, or people that I knew that were really, really great leaders. People loved to work for them. They had reached a level of success in their organization. And I interviewed all of them in depth about how they became a great leader. And I can tell you, David, across the board, 100%, every one of them said in very different ways, but said the same thing, that what they did is they paid attention. They watched the bad leaders around them, they watched the good leaders around them, and they paid attention to what they did. And they took note of what they did. And when the bad leaders did things that annoyed the heck out of them and were really, made them distraught, they would make note of that. They would physically get ill about what that person did. I will never do that, they would say. And they learned that so deeply that they didn't have to ever worry about falling in that trap. When they saw a great leader do something fantastic, they would make a note about it and say, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to do that. I love the way they just did that with that team meeting or with that individual or with the organization. So I think paying attention is what is the most important thing when you're just getting started. I would also encourage your listeners, if they're not in leadership yet or just getting started, to find a mentor. to find someone that they can talk to about leadership and the topic, because it's a big topic. There's a lot to be discussed. There's a lot to be learned. So even with just one good mentor, an individual can grow rapidly because their mind can be expanded and they can see things that they've never seen before.
And I think that's very good advice on both fronts to the audience members in both stages of their careers. Mentorship, I've found, can be a challenge, and I mean that from both sides. Finding a mentor who's willing to actually make time, not just say they'll make time, can be tough. Understanding what a modern mentorship relationship should look like, I think, is tough, right? Because it's not an 1800s apprentice master type of situation. It's much less formal than that. But how much advocacy should the mentor do on behalf of the mentee, I think, is a question. And then from the mentor side, I think, at least for me, I've had the opportunity to be a mentor a couple times through an alumni program for my graduate school. And knowing how to target my advice combined with the element of imposter syndrome. Like, am I really qualified to advise this person? So with some of those comments on mentorship, does any of that strike a chord where you'd want to sort of drill into the mentorship element, like where to find one, things to keep in mind as a mentor or mentee, anything in there, ring home for you?
Yes, I wish it was cleaner. You're talking about the challenges. It is challenging. It is complicated for a lot of organizations. I think the best way to find a mentor is to network, to talk to people. Mm-hmm. You could just say, hey, who do you know that's a great leader? Or who's the best boss you've ever had before? And who do you think might be open to talking to me about what they do as a leader? I think I would network and really be careful about who I ask to be mentored by. I would also, to your point, because mentoring is challenging, I would be careful that mentoring doesn't mean that they know everything about all things, and that you have to take the mentoring relationship and the information that you're getting with a grain of salt. You have to need to understand. Sometimes it's going to be right on task, and sometimes it's not, and you have to discern which it is. So be careful that you don't just do everything your mentor tells you to do or adopt every idea that they suggest.
Right. No, that makes sense, and I appreciate the several tactical items and advice that you've given across our conversation today. I want to be cognizant of your time because I know you've got a hard stop. So where can people find you, find info on Best Boss Ever?
Well, if you're interested in the book, you can certainly find it on Amazon. It seems to be the best bookseller in the world. So that's the easiest place. If you want to learn more, get some free resources, you can go to my website, which is donfrericks.com, and certainly look up more information there. And if you'd like to call, my contact information is there. If you want to call and chat, or if you want to send an email, you can do that as well.
All right. Well, Don Frericks, author of Best Boss Ever and advocate of improved leadership in our many industries across America, I appreciate you coming on today, talking with me about a couple topics. We went down a couple of rabbit holes, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, David.